Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the RT Park Business Attraction Summit. For those of you that I have not met out there in the audience, my name is Eric Saunier. I'm Director of Business Attraction and Entrepreneurship here at the RT Park. And I hope you've been enjoying the past day and a half. I know we have. Things have been going really well here. We've had an opportunity to meet a lot of wonderful people. And our next speaker is just that. You're going to really enjoy what she has to say. And without further ado, I want to introduce Ms. Suzette Yasmin Robotham. She is diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner in tech. She's a speaker, connector, coach, and a leading Black woman in tech. She has nearly 20 years of experience with expertise in talent acquisition, diversity and inclusion initiatives, leadership development, strategic planning, and relationship building across various industry sectors. Over her career, she has worked in large urban school districts, as well as education reform organizations like Teach for America. She has led diversity, equity, and inclusion teams and programs at both Facebook and Google, and has been tapped as a speaker by a number of organizations across the US, Canada, Europe, and Africa for her thought leadership and authenticity in the workplace and diversity and inclusion. She has been a featured TEDx speaker and a TNJ 40 Under 40 2019 honoree. In December 2021, Suzette was featured in the premiere episode of the Meredith Corporation created See Her, Multiplicity docuseries, focused on women of color and code switching on healthmagazine.com. An alumna of the University of Florida and the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University, Suzette currently lives, works, and plays in Brooklyn. With that, I'd like to bring up Suzette. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is my first time doing a conference in this setting. It's extremely exciting. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm honored to be invited. Coming to St. Croix, while I knew it was going to be an amazing journey, I didn't know it was going to be an adventure. So I made it. My bag did not. My bag is currently on vacation in Italy. Long story short, people in tech, make sure you check your bag tags because the airlines need to catch up with our technology. So I want to put it out there in someone's mind. If there's an app that you're thinking about creating, helping the airlines figure out how they better track bags is something that should be on the docket. Although it's just Italy calling to me and saying, hey sis, we need another vacation. So again, as Eric so kindly said, my name is Suzette Yasmin Robotham, and I'm proud to be here. I'm excited to be here. And I think it's a really important conversation because as we're thinking about growing our industries, as we're thinking about expanding in tech, as we're thinking about collaboration and how organizations work and build together, I think it's really important that we focus on the way that we think about the attraction, the development, and the retention of talent, right? I think sometimes we think so much about the external forces and the features and the focus of that, but to not be people-centric and to not be focused on the folks that are in our organizations and how we bring them in and make them feel welcome, but know that they can learn, grow, and develop, is to the detriment of the work. No one wants to have an organization that's a leaky bucket because brain drain leads to some monetary risk and adversity as well. And so, one of my favorite folks in the world, feminist thinker, Black feminist thinker, lesbian, phenomenal Black woman, Audre Lorde, wrote a lot of discourse around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she said, in our work and in our living, we must realize that difference is a reason for celebration and growth rather than a reason for destruction. And I think a lot of times when folks hear the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, they freeze up. Right? And not because people are afraid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but because folks don't want to do the wrong things. I would like to extend everybody an 880 FICO score to say that you're actually starting from a full credit report of having good intentions, right? And so I think it's when we pause and take the opportunity to educate folks first around identity and perspective and how our experiences in the world actually impact our understanding of others and how we show up and help us to really lean in to understand then the experiences of other, that we can begin the work of creating more equitable organizations that are inclusive for folks, right, and represent the diversity of the world that we serve. So I want to introduce you to myself a little bit more, right? So it's like, okay, he read that bio, and bios are cute, but it's like, sometimes you listen to a bio and you're like, who is that person? And really want to anchor you in who I am, what I focus on, and a little bit more in my journey.
Code switching comes in a lot of different forms. It can be everything from the way you speak, your vernacular, hiding an accent, to full out not communicating or sharing elements of your identities where folks might be making an assessment or a judgment about your value or your worth. I've been consistently doing my nails since my freshman year of college. It's just a way of being and a way of life for me and who I am. Because at the end of the day, what we're looking at is art on my hands, and I get to rock it every single day. So, like, who says that's not professional? My name is Suzette Yasmin Robotham. I'm northern born, southern reared, island infused. I am a talent acquisition exec in tech, and I live, work, play in Brooklyn. My style is decisive and intentional. I have watched male leaders, specifically white male leaders, that are also viewed as being decisive and direct, be cheered on. And when I have shown up in conversations, especially for the work I do, and been direct, oh, Suzette, like, you're being emotional, or, you sound really angry. And I'm like, I'm not angry. My tone has not changed. I think we have to be cognizant of what that means for experiences, especially Black women in the workplace. Not only in some instances am I the only person or the only one leading, but now if I, speak up or don't communicate in a certain way, my message can't be heard in the same way as a peer. What I will not compromise on is being able to lean in and lead and show up as who I am as a person.
Where every single person could show up and feel like they could be authentically themselves. So welcome to the conversation. We're going to spend some time not only unpacking the significance and importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this space, but I want to make sure that I'm giving folks resources and tools and some direction around how we actually co-build and create space for folks to be able to identify with each other, leveraging a lens of vulnerability, empathy, and ultimately what it allows for us to create is a space for authenticity. So we have 4 kind of key objectives for this conversation today. I want to create a foundational understanding of why diversity in our organizations is important through a lens of vulnerability, empathy, and authenticity. If you think back to how I started the conversation, I talked about the significance and importance of beginning the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey with an understanding of identity, who we are, and how we orient to the world, but then how we then create that common connection with folks to better understand how we meet each other where we are and do the work together. I want to make sure we provide a safe space for you all to explore why vulnerability, empathy, and authenticity are foundational, right, to building strong connections. Because at the root of this, right, how you build a team, how you build a company, how you build an organization, how you build a future comes from the ways that we are connecting with each other. I'm going to ground us in what's at stake. So I would be remiss if I didn't lean into the fact that I know everyone in tech and folks in all kinds of industries are very data-driven, and so I want to make the linkage between what it is that I'm trying to explain to everyone around that perspective around vulnerability, but also what's at stake in terms of not only the experience of folks, but the rates that people leave organizations when they don't feel a sense of connection to their teams. And last and most certainly not least, I'm going to leave you all with a tool that you can use with your teams to begin to build that bridge of connection. So what I ask you to do, I know that we're all virtual. I feel like the folks in the room with me are giving me their full attention, so I need you at home to be present, or wherever you might be participating with us today. I want you to be comfortable being uncomfortable. The reality of this is, because diversity, equity, and inclusion is a core values journey, right? It's a journey that makes you look deeply at yourself and what you believe and understand. Sometimes it can, shake up some things in ourselves that we may not be exactly comfortable with. But I want you to sit with that discomfort because it's the beginning place for you to begin to evolve and take yourself to the next level. It's a judgment-free zone, so it's safe space, and because I'm not with you there, it's even safer, I hope. It's confidential, and last and most certainly not least, solutions-oriented. So I want to start with a quick question. If you are somewhere at home with a piece of paper in front of you, I want you to take just a second to respond to the following question. I want you to think back over the course of your life, right? As much as I would like to say I look young and fun, my niece said I'm heading toward a little bit of oldness, right? And so think across the entire spectrum, right? I have 40 years to think across wherever you might be in your journey of life. Have you ever had the experience of feeling like an outsider? What did that feel like? What do you wish someone would have done for you at that moment? So I want you to sit with that question for about 30 seconds. And I know virtually 30 seconds is not necessarily going to be a real 30 seconds. But the reason I start with that question is, imagine then going into a work environment where you are an outsider every single day. And when you look at the demographics of tech in particular, we know that there are folks going into organizations where they may not see another person that looks like them, right? And with the commitment that many organizations have made to being more representative of the world that we serve, we have to take that outsider perspective into consideration as we think about the culture we want to build, as we think about the ways that we want to recruit talent into our organizations, into our teams. And again, coming back to Queen Audre Lorde, it is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences that divide us, right? And so we know that when you think from a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you open up the world in ways that you may not have otherwise done it, right? And so even thinking about opening up the tech ecosystem in the Caribbean, you're finding talent that you may not have otherwise found, right? And so it's the difference that we have. It's the different perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds that we bring to the table that make our organizations even better. So what's at stake, right? I know you're like, Suzette, this is all flowers and candy. It's super cute for you to be here talking about this and really wanting to connect with us as a person, but there are real significant outcomes attached to not thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of how your organizations grow and develop. So I want to start with recruiting talent, right? And there's a recent study that was done that was focused on the experience of first-generation American students in the United States of America. So I want to acknowledge that this is very specific to the United States of America. And what they were trying to unpack and explore was, is there a variance in experience, especially for first-generation students, first-generation college students in this particular case, around their experience within the hiring process as they were exiting their senior year of college into the workforce? And what they found, right, because over the course of the last 2 years, we've also been virtual in terms of how we've been connecting with and recruiting talent, only 30% of these students agreed with the following statement: I am able to make a personal connection with interviewers during a virtual interview, right? And so we know that odds are already stacked against folks in regards to opportunity and access. And so for that few folks to feel like they actually connected with interviewers, what that then translated into is that the research also found within this same study, and also a cross-section of a study that they did with the American Sociological Review, was that recruiters then, right, you're not connecting with me, who are you connecting with? And what does that then ultimately mean for who's getting hired, right? And what they found for this group of first-generation students in particular was that it was less likely for them to receive an internship or full-time offer by December of their senior year. So as you think about someone's journey, right, you just spent 4 years in college, you've done your best, you're trying to grow and develop, and you get to the seat of being in front of a recruiter, and because you may not look like that person, or you haven't had similar experiences, and you may not have had other experiences in your life that have prepared you for this moment, you're leaving college unemployed, right? And so I know that underemployment is a huge conversation, especially in the United States, but just think about that experience, right? And then there's a term that I personally can't stand. I do not like culture fit, right? I think culture fit is a very monolithic view of thinking about an organization and a company. So we need to be transitioning to using a lens and a mindset of culture add. What is someone bringing that is an add-on, an additional element to your organization and culture? And the Startup Institute actually also did a study, and they asked over 300 companies, what are the actual skills that are most important, right? I want us to also to lay to rest the whole idea of pedigree hiring, right? Pedigree is insufficient. The college I went to, although go Gators, I'm a very proud alumnus of the University of Florida, right? But the places that you studied in alone are not sufficient, right, in terms of your success professionally. And neither are the technical skills, right? So sometimes you'll hear folks be like, oh, like so-and-so worked at, McKinsey or Bain, and so it automatically like makes them this professional that might be better than someone else. And like the reality of it is folks that are most successful actually can navigate within the gray and have a really strong and distinct set of soft skills that make them stronger in the workplace, right? And so it's the culture add, it's the things that people bring to the table that make them right for your organization, and no longer the idea and the principle of I had this specific experience and it makes me better set for your organization. So I also want to talk a little bit about the experience of the folks that are actually in your companies and organizations now. And so we're going to watch a little bit of my TED Talk. How many people know what covering is? By a show of hands. How many people have covered or hidden a portion of your character, who you are, your identity in the workplace? By a show of hands. Deloitte recently released a study on covering in the workplace and found that nearly 61% of over 3,000 diverse participants from various occupations and backgrounds regularly hid some aspect of who they were in the workplace on a daily basis. 61% of people, okay? Taking it even further, they found that 79% of Black participants, 67% of women of color, 66% of women, 63% of Latinos regularly hid some aspects of their identity in the workplace on a regular basis. And as an organization, right, think of how many more people would stay. Think of how many people would thrive. Think of how much you would increase performance if people could come to work and lead authentically as who they were. 53% of participants said that they felt like their leaders expected them to cover on a regular basis, while 48% felt like it was an organizational norm to come to work and cover who they were on a regular basis. Yes, organizational norms and culture are important, but in order to create a truly inclusive and open and diverse environment, people need to be able to show up and show out as themselves. Imagine the opportunity you would create if people could come and lead authentically as themselves at work. Do you need an example? I can give an example. I want to dig in some more on that data, right? And so Deloitte University done a study a while ago around the idea and notion of the impact and implications of employee retention when folks were covering, right? And so code switching, covering, sometimes interchangeable. And in that same study, 32% of the respondents in the Deloitte study indicated that covering had negatively impacted their sense of self, right? So imagine showing up to work every single day and because you couldn't be who you were, or people didn't understand you because you had a different background, or you had a different set of experiences, or you couldn't be who you fully were. The way that it deteriorated at the mental, emotional, and the physical well-being of folks. While 62% of all of the employees would have stayed if their companies had taken steps to create a more positive and environment, right? So can you imagine, right, of all the folks that have left in this KPOR study, which is another significant lens for studying the retention of talent, especially talent from underrepresented groups, if they would have been in a place where they felt like they could grow and thrive, they would have stayed at the organizations they left. And last and most certainly not least, 50% of all employees would have stayed if their companies would have taken steps to make the company culture more fair and inclusive, right? And so what we're going to step into and step through next is some work around how you then build that dynamic into your organization. How do you begin to create a culture that is inclusive, that is welcoming of folks no matter where they're from, leveraging lens of vulnerability, empathy, and authenticity. So again, we're going to take a second to do some self-reflection. So as a facilitator, I believe it is inappropriate for me to talk to you the whole time. I want to make sure that folks have takeaways, and so there are going to be a number of food for thought questions, a number of self-reflection questions here, because again, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, I know it's a journey and I need to meet you along it and bring you along with me. So if you are a leader that's thinking about hiring, if you are a founder that's thinking about growing your company and your team, if you're an executive that's been in an organization for a really long time, I want you to put on whatever hat it is that you're at, and I want you to ask yourself, what do we want every candidate to say about their hiring experience with our organization? Right? And in other sessions, I've had folks say, I want folks to say that they felt taken care of, they felt excited, that they felt like they understand the perspective of how they'd be included in the organization. From the lens of the interaction with recruiters, they want to say that folks felt trusted, right? What is it that you want people to say that they experienced when navigating your hiring process? And now I want you to think about it not only from the lens of how you're finding talent, but what do you want every employee to say about their professional journey and personal experience with our company, right? And so I got to learn and grow and develop. My organization not only talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they had a demonstrated effort to ensure that employees from underrepresented groups were included in decision-making, that there was a culture that was welcoming and inviting to folks, that there were ample opportunities to be promoted, right? There was no gaps in terms of the progression of folks on your teams. So what is it that you want people to say about their actual experience and journey of being in your organization? So let's talk vulnerability, empathy, and authenticity. I am a disciple of Brené Brown. I can't say enough about how much I love Brené. And I think the work that she has done, especially around her studies of vulnerability and how it leads to a space of authenticity and the connections that then leads to authentic and meaningful relationships, is really transformative, again, in building that bridge that we're talking about in terms of creating more inclusive environments. And so Brené says, to me, a leader is someone who holds themselves accountable for finding potential in people and processes, right? And so as a leader, and we are all leaders, so by virtue of the fact that I believe in every single person watching this, every single person in the room, we are all leaders, it is then our inherent responsibility, right, to look for the potential in future and current talent in our organizations to ensure that they can then come into our organizations and thrive, and that our processes, right, because we know that interviewing is one thing, but how people even navigate our interviewing process. Is there bias in our process? A leader has a responsibility to make sure that there are no barriers to entry for folks and there's equitable access for our teams. So somebody might be like, okay, Suzette, this is, again, I get you, I hear you, you want me to build these strong relationships, right? But the big thing is, like, what does vulnerability have to do with diversity, right? And the reality is, if you think about it, take a second and pause, vulnerability is actually really foundational to building relationships with anyone, right? It's very foundational for how we connect with each other, right? And so in order to actually have a meaningful connection, the ways that we open up to each other are really important for creating the teams and the connection points and the culture that we want, right? And then once you have that connection, connections lead to strong relationships with both your teammates and your candidates in your hiring process, right? And so it's getting us across that threshold and bridge of showing who we are and how we feel and what we believe, and we'll talk some more about what vulnerability is not in a second, to then really set the foundation and the tone for trust. So if I trust you, right, it allows me to take that step further and build that bridge to empathy, which vulnerability is a door for. And last and most certainly not least, when people feel connected, right, and we talk about the cultural environment, then they feel safe, they feel connected, and more importantly, they feel respected and valued in your organization and your environment. So I'm going to pause you again for some food for thought. So take a second, take in what I just talked about. We do not want our candidates having different experiences in our hiring processes because of a variance in connection with our teams, right? And so to state that plain, I don't want two different candidates having a different experience with your recruiter simply because one may be a cisgender heterosexual Black woman and someone may be a cisgender heterosexual white male, right? We should have a similar experience, engagement, and connection with your recruiter, and it should not differ because of who we are. Additional food for thought is we do not want our talent having different experiences on our teams because of a variance in connection with us as leaders. So in that same regard, I, as a cisgender heterosexual Black woman on your team, should not have a difference of experience in terms of how you coach, develop, support, manage, grow, and develop me because I don't look like my teammate that sits next to me. So what is vulnerability? So I know you're like Suzette, okay, vulnerability, I've heard Brené's podcast, I kind of know what it is. I'm gonna make it simple and break it down for you. Vulnerability is uncertainty, right? It's an acknowledgement of, you know, things aren't always black and white. There can be some gray in there, right? It has a little bit of the gooiness of like not being fully formed, so it's uncertain. It's risky, right? Vulnerability requires you to step outside of your comfort zone and be fully present and engaged as who you are as a person, right? And that can feel risky, especially in work environments and cultures where that has not been or is not the norm. Some emotional exposure, right? Like, it requires me to state and understand my feelings, right? I have to be connected with how I'm actually feeling in my gut. I don't know how many of you are tuned into human design, but as a generator, I often pause and wait to respond because I'm waiting for that gut feeling, right? It means I have to be connected and be present for how I'm actually feeling. And it allows for authenticity, right? So if I feel like you're being vulnerable, if we've done that thing to build foundational trust, then I feel like I can be who I am. Your team members feel like they can be who they are and trust that they can show up and deliver and be who they are authentically. And it comes from a starting place of best intentions. So again, I came in, I told you all, we have a FICO score of 880. And so I'm extending to each of you perfect credit with the belief that from a lens of vulnerability, you are coming to me with your best intentions and how we're connecting and what we're talking about and what we're moving forward on. So let's also talk about what vulnerability is not. Vulnerability is not expressing emotions that you do not actually feel. So I want you to take a second and think about how many times, right, there's something that happens, you know the person hasn't really processed it, but they kind of lean in to be like, oh yeah, I was mad too. And you're like, but you're smiling. I don't know if you're actually really mad, right? And so people know when you are expressing emotions that you do not feel, right? It's kind of like, the best example I could use, because I am so guilty of it, is when somebody texts you something that's supposed to be funny and you type LOL, but you're not laughing or smiling, right? So don't express something that you don't actually feel. Vulnerability is not inauthentic, right? So in order for it to be a fully vulnerable space, it has to be true to who you are, it has to be true to the experience and the timing, and it's authentic, right? People can feel that meaningful connection and the trust in it. Vulnerability isn't weakness, right? I think a lot of times folks are like, I can't be vulnerable because the team won't actually think that I'm a strong leader, or I can't show our vulnerability because people won't be excited about investing in us, right? But vulnerability actually allows folks to see where you are at in your journey or where you are at in your space and connect with you in a really important way so that they can also feel empathetic to you. There is no get out of vulnerability free card, right? So no one's gonna, like if we're playing Monopoly, nobody's gonna like let you skip it, right? There's no like, you don't get to be vulnerable in a space where other folks are being vulnerable, right? It's a shared space, it's a shared commitment to be present. Vulnerability isn't everything but the kitchen sink. And so what does that mean? Vulnerability, people can sometimes use vulnerability to gaslight you or can use kind of faux vulnerability. And so vulnerability isn't you being expressive in this super demonstrative way where people are like, I don't actually know if you're being like fully transparent in this moment. And so it's also like being really intentional about how and what and where you're sharing it and bringing what is most meaningful into that space. Vulnerability is not a solo mission, right? So again, if we're talking about connection and people, vulnerability then means that we are bringing people along the journey with us and creating a space where folks also feel like they can be vulnerable. And last and most certainly not least, vulnerability is also not shameful, right? And so we don't want to send people into shame because they've chosen to open up and share themselves with us in their space. So now that we've talked about vulnerability, let's talk about why empathy, right? And it's once you've created the space for people to know and understand, right, and experience who you are, empathy allows us to bridge and to have those meaningful connections with other people because we're suspending our own need to center ourselves to understand the perspective of others. So I have a question for you. Another food for thought question. If you can't empathize with the people you are inspiring about the opportunity ahead of them at your organization, right? How can you create the understanding that they also belong at your organization? I'm gonna say it again. Let this sit in your spirit. If you cannot empathize with the people you are inspiring about the opportunity ahead of them at your organization, how can you create the understanding that they also belong at your organization? So, but why? Okay, we're gonna do another video. I want you to get a quick kind of voiceover that Brene Brown did in this cartoon video that walks you through and helps you understand what empathy really actually is.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
What makes something better is connection. Right? And so I just want to again thank the RT Park team, Aquanet and Danny and everyone that has expressed deep empathy with me. I had to go buy clothes, so I did not bring this outfit. And as a shopper, I I planned on shopping, didn't know I was going to have to buy a wardrobe while I was here, but just the empathy, right, that was extended to me, the connection of, I can understand what it feels like to have all of your luggage, all of your makeup, all of your stuff gone, right, as a very simplistic example, and making sure that I had what I needed. Aquanet going so far as to bring me something at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's just one of those things where it has a strong connection. So likely my firstborn needs to be named after her, right? But no, I have a whole bunch of people that are like, no, your firstborn was named after me, because clearly I'm someone that's always in need of empathy. But empathy is that actual, like, I can suspend how I feel enough and not center myself to better understand how you feel. So as a leader, it's how do you allow space for your team members, your folks to actually really show up? How do you connect with them in a way where you're able to understand and see their perspective? And so the 4 key attributes of empathy are, first, seeing from someone else's perspective. It's non-judgmental, right? Like, if you're suspending, right, your perspective to allow for the experience of another to be centered, right, and to be understood, you can't judge it, right? Like, empathy is not, I don't know about that, or I wouldn't do that, right? Empathy is, tell me more about that, right? And it's, we gotta be in touch with our own feelings to understand someone else's, right? So I have to understand the pain of being in a situation where I might have been an outsider. I have to understand the pain of a situation of where I might have been delayed or missed something, and what that made me feel like, in order to then be in touch and understand how you might feel. And it's feeling with people, right? So how many times, and I live in, you know, the best borough on the planet, Brooklyn, but New Yorkers are notorious for this, right? So you see me walking down the street and you're like, hi. And I'm like, hi, and I'm like, how are you? And you keep walking, right? You're not trying to feel with me, right? It's like that courtesy. Empathy is more than a courtesy. It's tell me more, help me to understand, like give me more insight and perspective on why you feel that way and what you've experienced, so I can be connected to what it is that you're actually feeling and going through, so I can help you move forward. So then the why of vulnerability and empathy is we allow people to be seen and be who they are, right? Vulnerability and empathy create the space for authenticity. So again, if you think back to that very first video, I've literally been rocking nails for 20 years, and spaces where people actually are curious, right? Help me to understand more about the colors that you choose or why you have nails, as opposed to making comments that may not feel so great to me, right, about my nails, right? It allows me to feel seen, like you want to know more and understand my perspective and experience. And it allows me to be authentically who I am as a person, allows you to be authentically who you are as a person. So food for thought, because again, this is not just my exercise, it's an opportunity for you all to reflect and think, is how might having an authentic connection with you change the perspective that a candidate from an underrepresented group might have about your company? Right? So how does my engagement with you change my perspective or understanding about why XYZ company, XYZ startup, XYZ corporation is the next great place for me to grow and develop as a professional? And then how might having an authentic connection with you change the experience and professional trajectory for a team member from an underrepresented group at your organization, right? So how does having a connection where I know that you're committed to my growth and development elongate the belief that I can actually stay and grow and develop and have a career at your organization? I'm at the point, for instance, in my own journey, I no longer want a career hop. I want to go somewhere and know that I can have a long-term career, right? And so what does that connection with you mean, and how does it become the difference maker in my ability to see myself there long-term? So we're at the part of the presentation where I'm going to walk you through an exercise that you'll get as a takeaway. I think it's a really great way for folks, especially as you're thinking about growing teams, for folks that are currently leading teams, to actually really from a structured lens begin to create a space for vulnerability, empathy, and authenticity in your teams. And it's an exercise called the window panes. And again, the window panes team building exercise is a structured way for you all to experience authentic vulnerability, and it will allow you to build your empathy muscles, right? So what I'm saying to you today is I'm not expecting that everyone is going to leave this conversation and automatically be just an empathy champion, right? Much like the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey is you working at it every single day, building empathy, building spaces for authentic vulnerability is a day-to-day practice. And so there are 5 kind of key objectives for the window panes exercise. The first is to build deeper relationships amongst your team. It will help reveal hidden attributes about your identities, right? And so without you having to like go and word vomit that I'm Suzette Yasmin Obafin, first generation American, my parents are from Jamaica, and on and on and on, it gives you a really clear-cut way to share experiences that feel authentic in that moment and allows you to feel safe being vulnerable. It's gonna then highlight themes and values that influence who you are today. And it's also going to help you create a shared understanding of your teammates' values, right? And the things that you have in common and the things that make you uniquely different. And it's also going to help you notion the other thing that's kind of foundational to both vulnerability and empathy, the idea of listening to build relationships, right? So you're not listening to respond. It's not a Suzette said her stomach hurts and it's, well, do you need medicine? It's Suzette says her stomach hurts and allowing space for me to tell you more about why. So also in that packet that you're going to get online, you're going to see a sample of what the window panes team building exercise looks like, and it literally looks like a 4 window pane. Please pardon me, I know I probably dated myself. This is what my window looked like growing up, especially in Virginia. But how you will break out your window panes is in the very first upper left quadrant. You're going to talk about your strengths, right? So what are the things, both established and emerging, would you consider your strengths? And so examples of that might be you're a strong relationship builder, you know how to navigate complex challenges, you're really committed and able to problem solve, right? Whereas, you know, something that might be emerging, especially for instance, you're a new parent, might be sharing parental responsibilities. So it's your strengths both as a professional, but also as a person, right? Because you don't want to be vulnerable in a space of just talking about who you are professionally, because we know we're more than professionals, we're people first. And in that lower left quadrant, you're going to talk about your challenges, right? Both previous or new on the horizon, right? So some of that might be setting realistic deadlines, right? It might be procrastination. It might be like, I struggle not working when I get home. What are the things that are actual challenges for you? In that upper right quadrant, you're going to then talk about your heroes and role models, right? Both established and emerging. So my role model and my hero is my mother, of course, and my very first manager. But who are the folks that really inspire you? There might be an emerging role model that you're like, oh, like this person really does things that I'm excited about and want to continue to learn and grow and develop around. And then that lower right quadrant is going to be a metaphor. So something that symbolizes your life right now. So that is not just a yellow dot on the screen. That is the best that I could do to make a sun on a PowerPoint presentation. But for me, that metaphor is sun is shining. So I grew up in a household where I very much thought Bob Marley might be like my grandfather because we had like this big watercolor. But Sun is Shining is one of my favorite songs because regardless of whatever happens, right? Regardless of my bag going to Italy, the sun still came up this morning. I'm alive, I'm resourced, I'm well. And so the sun, no matter what happens, even if the clouds are out, is still shining. So that's my metaphor for life. And then last, most certainly not least, in that bottom little, you'll have like a window ledge. You're going to put a quote that are words to live by. And one of my favorite quotes in the world is by James Baldwin. And it says, the world is before you and you need not take it or leave it as when you came in, right? And as someone that actively works to disrupt in organizations, I see the world as an opportunity to continue to both learn, to grow, develop, but also challenge systems that keep us from creating equitable access for folks in our organizations. So here's what you're going to do, and these instructions are also in the packet that you'll be able to download later. You're going to give your team space to create their window panes. Window panes should take about 15 minutes. I recommend butcher paper, markers, provide colors, make it an experience, but only give people 15 minutes to create them because any longer and folks are going to come back with novels, right? And the point of this exercise is not to come back and having folks give soliloquies, but really folks pulling out the highlights, the things that they really want to share in this space with you and your team. And then you'll do the second half of this slide, which talks about how you actually share out. So every single person on your team will go around. You'll spend 5 minutes with folks just walking you through every single one of those frames in your window pane. And then after the 5 minutes are done, I recommend using a timer. You'll spend about 2 to 3 minutes asking questions about what you heard. So Suzette, I heard you say that, you really are inspired by your mother and you really are inspired by your first manager. How does that show up in then how you lead as a manager, right? And so taking that opportunity to really lean into that space that I talked to you all about in terms of listening to build relationships and listening to understand. And then at the end of the exercise, you're going to come back as a collective team and jot down all of the things that you all saw in terms of trends and the things that you saw in unique differences. And I will tell you, every single time I've done this training, one, the joy meter goes up as people begin to share more and more of their window panes, but two, folks walk away feeling more connected to folks than they have ever before in terms of their teams, because they haven't actually paused to like empathize and listen and authentically connect with their teammates. And so I'm excited to share this exercise with you all. I'm excited to have been here today, and I hope that this window panes exercise helps you in your journey of creating a more authentic environment for your team members to thrive and grow and develop. Questions? Can we do? Oh, awesome. Thank you.
First, I just want to thank Suzette, and if you do have questions, you can submit them online, and she will address each one of the questions one by one. If you don't get them immediately, you know, we have a few other things going on, but you will get your questions answered. So we encourage everyone to please engage, please ask those questions. I took copious notes and knew I couldn't come up here and say too much, but I do want to first vouch for Suzette's nails, right? There was that video where she was getting her nails done. Her nails look amazing, in spite of the fact that she lost her bag and all the issues she had traveling here. But there are a few things that I do want to encourage you guys to do at home. One is take advantage of that window pane exercise. If you hired Suzette as a consultant, you'd probably pay a lot of money to get access to those types of tools. So take advantage of that. Work on that with your team. Two is just reflect on the food for thoughts that she put in the presentation. I think those were extremely thought-provoking questions, and I encourage you to go back and review those and just kind of reflect and think about what was asked and presented to you. And then three, I want to acknowledge that conversations about empathy and vulnerability are extremely tough to have, especially in a workplace. And I just want to commend and thank Suzette for being a professional out there in the world and forcing people to have those conversations at Fortune 500 companies and bringing these conversations to light. So thank you again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of today.